gas law. Yeah.
All right. Can everybody's attention?
Yeah.
I need everybody's attention because I got an important announcement. Okay? So, as some of you know, I went on a trip what was it, 3 weeks ago to Virginia to do a run, and my flight got an unexpected delay of 13 hours. And so I got there late, and I wasn't able to complete the run that I wanted to. Because by that time I didn't get any sleep the night before too. So anyway, I'd like to ask if it's okay if I try another race this weekend.
Yeah.
So in order to do that, I have to catch a flight out of Sioux Falls again, and don't worry because TSA contracts out to work there, so there shouldn't be any long lines I have to worry about, like you may have heard about on the news at some airports. I'm flying into a smaller airport, so that shouldn't be a problem either coming back. So anyway, I'll do the same as I did last time, if that's all right with everybody. I'll record a video, and I'll put it on Canvas for class on Friday. Okay. So I won't have to miss my other class on Friday because my flight doesn't leave until 3. But I wouldn't be able to get there in time if we met for class. So, all right. So I'm going to Maryland this time. So hopefully I can get there, as opposed to last time I didn't get there in time.
Good luck, though.
So,
Good luck, though.
so yeah. It's a small town called Parkton. It's like out in the middle of nowhere.
Baltimore?
So, it sounds like a pretty place, though. So. Okay. So, just want to do a short, quick recap. On Monday, we learned that the rate of diffusion across respiratory membranes is affected by the partial pressure gradient of the gas that's diffusing, and it also is affected by the solubility of the gas that's diffusing. Some gases diffuse into water better than others, and all respiratory surfaces are always covered with water, okay, because gases have to diffuse in water before they can go through that respiratory surface. And that's why, if we take a look at the exchange of oxygen and CO2 across the walls of the alveoli, or, well, this is in the tissues actually, but it's similar, it's just the opposite for the alveoli. That's why CO2 and oxygen diffuse at about the same rate, even though the concentration gradient for CO2 is a lot lower. Okay, so just like in the tissues, there's only a difference in partial pressure of 6 millimeters, yet CO2 diffuses just as fast as oxygen. Okay, now in addition to the partial pressures and the solubility of gases, there are some other factors that can affect the rate of diffusion, and hence the delivery of oxygen to our tissues. One of these factors is the partial pressure of gases in air at different altitudes. That can be a big factor. For example, if you go to like one of the peaks up in Colorado, what they call the 14ers, it's over 14,000 foot peaks. Instead of having a total air pressure of 760 millimeters mercury, the air pressure is only 440, because at a higher altitude, air pressure is a lot lower. And since the total air pressure is lower, the partial pressures of all the gases are lower as well. And so at 14,500 feet, which is about the altitude maybe at the top of some of the ski areas in Colorado, partial pressure of oxygen is only 92 millimeters mercury instead of 159. So it's what? That's probably 40% lower than it is at sea level. And that difference is enough to decrease that partial pressure gradient between the air in our alveoli and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. And that's why if you go up to a high altitude and it doesn't take very much, you can just go up maybe one flight of stairs and you're really out of breath, okay? That's because partial pressures of gases, all the respiratory gases are lower. Now, the opposite of that is if you put a person in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. A hyperbaric oxygen chamber is a chamber that's pressurized and it has a higher concentration of oxygen. And so if you have the pressure at 3 to 4 times the normal atmospheric pressure, the partial pressure of oxygen is anywhere between 2,300 and 3,000 millimeters mercury instead of 159 millimeters mercury. That increases the concentration gradient. So that's going to greatly increase the diffusion of oxygen into that person's blood. And so sometimes they do put patients in hyperbaric chambers in order to speed up the healing process because it's able to deliver more oxygen. They might also do that if a person has a compromised respiratory system, if they have a disordered respiratory system. Okay, now another factor that can affect the diffusion of oxygen and CO2 is the thickness of the respiratory membrane. And the respiratory membrane ordinarily is only about half a micron thick. That's really thin. That's not much more than the thickness of a cell membrane. Okay, so respiratory gases don't have very far to travel to get across those respiratory membranes, so they can diffuse very rapidly because distance is one of the factors that affects the rate of diffusion. And that's actually much less than the diameter of a red blood cell. But there are certain medical conditions that can increase that effective distance. One of them would be if someone has congestive heart failure and their heart is not able to pump blood as well. That could cause blood to back up into the lungs, and it can cause fluid to start filling the alveoli. And if you get fluid in the alveoli, then that increases the distance that oxygen molecules have to travel to get through the respiratory membranes. And so that's going to slow down the rate of oxygen transport. And so it's going to prevent the blood from picking up as much oxygen, and it's going to prevent the blood from giving up as much carbon dioxide. So that's going to make it hard for that person to breathe. Even though it's a heart condition, it also is going to affect their respiratory system. And then another factor is the surface area available for gas exchange. So a healthy lung has a surface area of about 70 square meters, which is about the size of one side of a volleyball court. And there are some conditions like emphysema, lung cancer, and tuberculosis, which is an infection of the lungs, that can greatly reduce that surface area by breaking down alveoli. If you break down the alveoli, it'll form larger spaces in the lungs, but it decreases the surface area. And that can reduce the rate of gas exchange. Now, another factor that affects gas exchange is a concept called ventilation perfusion coupling. Ventilation perfusion coupling refers to a balance of airflow and blood flow to a part of the lung. So, in order for gas exchange to occur efficiently, you not only have to have enough airflow to a part of the lung, but you also have to have sufficient blood flow. it doesn't do any good to move air in and out of your lungs if you don't have enough blood to pick up the oxygen, okay? And so our lungs automatically regulate the amount of airflow and blood flow to make sure that there's a match between airflow and blood flow. So if you have poor ventilation to a part of the lung, then that will stimulate vasoconstriction of the blood vessels in that part of the lung, and that will reroute the blood to another area of the lung that has better airflow. So it's kind of a form of autoregulation. Or if you have low blood flow to an area of a lung, then you'll get bronchoconstriction of the airways to that part of the lung, and that will decrease the airflow because it doesn't do any good to have a lot of airflow if you don't have very much blood flow. Okay, so it's a form of autoregulation of blood flow and airflow in the lung that makes sure that there's always enough airflow to match the blood flow and vice versa. All right, let's do a review question. So this is just a simple, straightforward question about which of the gases that we discussed on Monday, which one of those gases has the lowest partial pressure in the atmosphere? Okay, and so the gases that we talked about were carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, and water vapor. So which of those ordinarily is the lowest? Call. All right, let's take a look at everybody's responses. Most of you said carbon dioxide, and that's correct. Concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is only 0.04%, which is less than 0.1%. Okay, so it's very, very low. And so that way, the CO2 that our body produces can diffuse out of the blood and into the air that's in our alveoli. Now, the CO2 levels in the alveoli is higher than 0.04%, and that's partly because you get a mixture of old air that has been blown out of the lungs along with the fresh air that comes in, since there's a two-way of flow of air in and out of the lungs. So the one that's in the highest concentration is actually nitrogen, at about 78%, somewhere around there. But nitrogen is pretty much just an inert gas, and oxygen is just a little over 20%. All right, so the next part of chapter 22 is concerned with transport of respiratory gases in the blood. And there are only two respiratory gases that we need to be concerned with. There's oxygen that has to be transported from our lungs back to the heart, where it can be pumped out to all the other organs of our body, and then transport of CO2 from all the cells of our body back to the lungs, where that CO2 can be eliminated. So before we do that, let's do one more review question. So this one says, which of the following is a factor affecting the rate of gas exchange? should be easy question, so if we just went over this. Okay, you can still answer. Let's take a look at everybody's answer so far. Most of you said all the above, and that's correct. So those are some of the factors we just went over. All right. Okay. So as I said, gas transport involves the movement of gases from the bloodstream to the lungs and to the tissues, and from the tissues to the lungs. And both CO2 and oxygen are transported by the blood. Transport occurs in both the plasma as well as inside the red blood cells. But red blood cells actually play a more important role in the transport of both gases, both oxygen and carbon dioxide. So let's start first with the transport of oxygen. The transport of oxygen is a little simpler than the transport of carbon dioxide because there are only two different mechanisms that are involved with the transport of oxygen. The first is that just a very, very tiny percentage of oxygen, only about 1.5%, is transported by the plasma. And the reason such a small percentage is transported by the plasma is because oxygen is not very soluble in water, which is what makes up most of the plasma. So all the rest of the oxygen, 98.5% of the oxygen, is transported by diffusing into the blood and then diffusing through the cell membrane of the red blood cells and binding to the heme group of hemoglobin. So if you remember from near the beginning of the semester when we were going through chapter 18 on the blood, remember that hemoglobin has 4 different subunits. They're called globin subunits. And there's an iron-containing heme group associated with each one of those 4 subunits. And it's the heme group that's inside of those protein subunits that the oxygen binds to. It actually binds to the iron that's right in the center of the heme group. Since there are 4 heme groups in each hemoglobin molecule, that means each hemoglobin molecule can transport up to 4 oxygen molecules. Okay? Now, keep in mind there may be many of these hemoglobin molecules in one blood cell. So one blood cell can transport a lot more than 4. Probably transport hundreds of oxygen molecules in each red blood cell. So there's 2 factors that affect the transport of oxygen. One is the number of red blood cells, and 2 is the concentration of hemoglobin in your blood. So a person can be anemic by either having too few red blood cells, or you might have a normal number of red blood cells, but if you don't have enough hemoglobin in those red blood cells, because maybe you don't have enough iron in your diet, then you can still be anemic. All right. Now, when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, then hemoglobin is referred to as oxyhemoglobin. So oxyhemoglobin is the compound that's formed when at least one oxygen molecule binds to hemoglobin. When all of the oxygen is removed from hemoglobin, it's called deoxyhemoglobin. And when hemoglobin picks up carbon dioxide in the systemic capillaries, it's called carbaminohemoglobin. So these are just different terms that physiologists use to refer hemoglobin that's combined with different kinds of respiratory gases. Now, one really interesting thing about hemoglobin is that once one oxygen molecule loads up on hemoglobin, it's easier for more oxygen to load up onto the hemoglobin. So the fewer oxygen molecules bound to hemoglobin, the easier it gives off oxygen. And so if you look at the relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood and the percent saturation of hemoglobin, it's not a straight line. And so when the partial pressure of oxygen is high, like in the lungs, where the partial pressure of oxygen is about 100, then hemoglobin will be 100% saturated. Okay? If you lower the partial pressure of oxygen from 100 millimeters to 60 millimeters, it still holds on to those oxygen molecules fairly tightly. And so at 60 millimeters, your percent saturation of hemoglobin is still about 97%, so it doesn't give up very much. So it holds on to oxygen very tightly at high partial pressures. But if the partial pressure of oxygen lowers to about 40 millimeters mercury, which is about what the partial pressure of oxygen is in the tissues, then it starts giving up oxygen faster and faster. Okay, and so this curve is called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And this curve is described as a sigmoidal curve. Sigmoid means S-shaped. So sigmoidal is an S-shaped curve. So even at the partial pressure of oxygen in venous blood, in the tissues, which is about 40 millimeters, hemoglobin is still almost 80% saturated. So what that means is if you have an increased demand for oxygen, so let's say your tissues, like say muscle tissue, starts becoming more metabolically active, that's going to lower the partial pressure of oxygen in that muscle even more. And because of the way that hemoglobin holds on to oxygen, it still has a reserve capacity of oxygen it can give up. So it won't give up all of its oxygen until the partial pressure of oxygen gets very, very low, because that's when you need the most oxygen, is when the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is the lowest. So because of the sigmoidal curve, hemoglobin always has a reserve capacity to give up oxygen should the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood go below what's normal. Okay. So when you get up to the lungs, when you're in a higher partial pressure, hemoglobin binds very tightly to that oxygen, and it won't give it up very easily. But when the partial pressures get very low, it gives up oxygen very easily. Okay. Any questions about transport of oxygen then? So the important thing to remember is that most all of the oxygen, 98.5%, is transported by binding to hemoglobin. Right? Now, transport of carbon dioxide in the blood is a little more complicated because there are 3 different mechanisms of carbon dioxide transport in the blood. And our blood picks up carbon dioxide when the blood is flowing through the capillaries in our tissue, in all the tissues of our body. So the 3 different mechanisms by which CO2 are transported. The first is that 7% of the carbon dioxide in the blood is transported just by dissolving the plasma. So remember, it was only at 1.5% for oxygen. The reason a higher percentage of CO2 is transported in the plasma is because CO2 is a lot more soluble in water, so it dissolves a lot more easily in the plasma. Then, of carbon dioxide is transported by binding to the globin portion of hemoglobin. Not the heme group, but the globin portion. The globin portion is the protein portion of hemoglobin. So almost a fourth of the CO2 binds to the globin proteins that make up the 4 subunits of hemoglobin. Okay. And that leaves another 70% though that's transported by a different mechanism. So 70% of carbon dioxide is transported by first diffusing into the red blood cells, and then the CO2 combines with water inside the cytoplasm of the red blood cells. And in the presence of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which is abbreviated as CAH, that CO2 is converted into carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. Carbonic acid is a weak acid, so a certain percentage of the carbonic acid will give off hydrogen ions, and the remainder of that molecule forms a bicarbonate anion. Bicarbonate is HCO3. Okay, so 70% of CO2 is transported as bicarbonate. Okay, but that bicarbonate doesn't stay in the red blood cells. It actually moves out of the red blood cells into the plasma. And by doing that, by transporting the bicarbonate out in the plasma, that lowers the concentration of bicarbonate inside the cytoplasm of the red blood cells, and that allows more CO2 to be converted into bicarbonate. And so that's how you can get such a high percentage of the CO2 being transported as bicarbonate. And that's actually eventually transported in the plasma. So, and then when the blood gets back to the lungs, you just have the reverse of that reaction occurs. When you get to the lungs, the bicarbonate moves back into the red blood cells, and then it's converted back to CO2, which then diffuses out of the blood and into the alveoli, where it's blown out of the lungs. All right, so this right here, this mechanism, is what happens as the blood is flowing through our tissues. Okay, 70% of the CO2 is converted to carbonic acid, which then breaks apart to form bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions actually bind to the hemoglobin, actually binds to the heme group of hemoglobin, and that causes the hemoglobin to give up its oxygen. So that's one of the reasons why hemoglobin gives up most of its oxygen when it gets to the tissues, because this hydrogen ion is formed when bicarbonate is formed in the tissues. That actually shifts the equilibrium towards deoxyhemoglobin instead of oxyhemoglobin. So that helps to deliver oxygen to the tissues. All right, now, once the blood gets back to the lungs, then what happens is the bicarbonate moves out of the plasma back into the red blood cells, and in order to maintain a balance of charges, that's exchanged with chloride. And then once that gets into the red blood cells, that increases the concentration of bicarbonate on the inside of the red blood cells. That shifts the equilibrium of that equation back to the left. And so if you get a high concentration of bicarbonate building up in the red blood cells, bicarbonate combines with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then breaks apart to form CO2 and water. The CO2 then diffuses across the respiratory membranes into the alveoli, where it can be blown out of the lungs. So it's just the reverse of the reaction. In addition, this hydrogen that combines with the bicarbonate to form carbonic acid, this hydrogen actually comes from hemoglobin that was carrying it from the tissues. And when hydrogen disassociates from the hemoglobin, then that causes the oxygen to bind more tightly with the hemoglobin. And so it facilitates the loading of the blood with oxygen. So you can sort of think of the red blood cells sort of like a real compact car, kind of like one of those little clown cars. You can only fit so many people in there. So if you have, let's say, 4 people, let's call them oxygen molecules. You have 4 oxygen molecules in there. If you load CO2 in there, there's not enough room for all those. Somebody has to get out because there's just not enough room. And so what happens is when CO2 loads up into the red blood cells in the tissues, then oxygen leaves to make room for that CO2, and that delivers oxygen. And then when you get back to the lungs, when the hydrogen ion combines with the bicarbonate, or excuse me, when the hydrogen ion leaves the hemoglobin, that gives more room for oxygen. So that facilitates the loading of the blood with oxygen. So the loading and unloading of oxygen and CO2 are linked together. Hemoglobin can only carry so many molecules. So if you load it up with oxygen, it's going to give up CO2. If you load it up with CO2, it gives up its oxygen, which is just what you need. That's just what needs to happen. All right, any questions? Okay, so I don't know if many of you had noticed, but I did add a new active learning assignment on Canvas. And so I think at this point, I'll give you some time to work on this. Let me go to Canvas so I can show you what I want you to do. What I want you to do is I want you to think of an analogy. I want you to come up with an analogy, okay? You can think of the red blood cells as a submarine that transports oxygen and carbon dioxide. And I want you to create a pictorial analogy, okay, that shows how the blood transports oxygen and, well, actually just CO2. Just CO2, since that's more complicated. Oxygen is simple. There's only 2 mechanisms, and most of it just binds to hemoglobin. CO2, though, is a little more complicated since it has 3. So let me show you the assignment.
Well, I'm making the best diagram. I need these 5 extra points.
So, as Sean just said, I'm going to kind of turn this into a little bit of a contest in that, and I get to be the judge and jury for this. Whoever comes up with the best visual analogy for how the blood transports carbon dioxide, I'm going to give them 5 extra bonus points on top of the 5 points for the assignment. Okay, and that 5 points will be added to our next exam. Okay, so let me show you the assignment. Let me scroll down here. Find it again.
This is Jen. That has a water for you to sing.
Okay, here's the assignment right here.
Wait,
okay?
just give me 5 extra points.
And this is going to be due by next Wednesday. Okay? So, since for this assignment I want you to develop a visual analogy or diagram of how carbon dioxide is transported to the blood. Just carbon dioxide. You don't have to show oxygen. I guess you can if you want to, if you think it would help you to learn. So in this diagram, I I don't want you to show a real diagram of a red blood cell, but instead something else that represents a red blood cell, like an airplane, or a boat, or a submarine, something like that. And it says you can draw this on paper by yourself, or you can draw it using a drawing app on your iPad, or if you want to, you can use AI. You can use a chat-based AI. You have to give it its prompts though. Okay, I want you to tell it what you want it to do. Okay, to generate an image. Okay. So it says use your imagination. Show the bicarbonate in the plasma as something else, like a jellyfish, and label it as bicarbonate. And this is worth 5 points. It's due next Wednesday. And the person that comes up with the best diagram will receive a bonus 5 points for the next exam. All right?
Professor, how does the picture I drew? How does this work? Is this 5 extra points? That's pretty good.
Yeah, I don't want to prejudge it. Okay. It's a nice diagram.
Yeah, that's thank you.
Yeah. I got all the How about percentages though?
I said first.
10%.
I got this. No, ask them. I didn't say it. No, mine's already made.
All right. So I'll let you work on that, and I think that's all we'll do for the rest of the period then is work on that assignment.